The wind in Montana Territory does not howl the way wind howls in other places. It does not roar. It does not whistle. In the Gallatin Valley, when the cold comes down from the high passes and runs through the channel between the ridges, it makes a sound like a long, slow breath drawn through clenched teeth. Steady, patient, the kind of sound that tells you something is waiting. In April of 1884, four men walked out across a stretch of melting snow east of Bozeman, looking for a body they already knew they would find. The thaw had come late that year, and the drifts had only just begun to retreat from the fence posts. The men were quiet. They had buried 6 neighbors already that month, pulled from places where the snow had hidden them since October. There was one more left to find. They found him with his arm raised. Hollis Calloway lay frozen in the position he had died in, one boot half lifted, as though he were still walking, his right hand reaching forward through the air. His fingers were curled around nothing. His eyes were open. He had died facing the direction of his own woodshed, and the men who found him measured the distance, because that is what men do when they cannot make sense of a thing. 17 feet. That was how far Hollis Calloway had been from his own door when the cold took him. 17 feet from the warmth of his own hearth. 17 feet from his wife. 17 feet from his 3 small sons. He had walked out into a blizzard on a Saturday evening to bring back firewood, and he had become disoriented in the white air. And he had walked perpendicular to his own porch, and he had stopped believing he was almost home. The men who lifted him did not speak. There was nothing to say that the distance had not already said. Now, before we go any further, I want you to understand something. Hollis Calloway was not a foolish man. He was not careless. He was a good husband and a steady worker and a neighbor who would lend you his last sack of flour if your children were hungry. He died because he listened to the advice that everyone in the valley considered correct. He built his woodshed 40 yards from his cabin, the way settlers had built woodsheds for generations. He kept his barn separate from his living quarters the way every reasonable carpenter recommended. He did exactly what the experienced men of Montana told him to do. And 3 miles away, in a structure that the entire valley had spent the previous summer mocking a Norwegian widow and her 7-year-old daughter, sat through that same blizzard without ever stepping outside, without losing a single animal, without burning their last stick of furniture, without coming within 100 miles of dying. Her name was Astrid Solberg. She was 30 years old. She had been called many things in the years since she arrived in Montana Territory. Stubborn, strange, foolish. A woman who did not know her place. A woman who built things wrong. A woman who would learn when winter came what real Montana men already understood. What none of them understood and what they would not understand until the snow finally cleared in April and they began counting their dead was that Astrid Solberg had not built her cabin wrong at all. She had built it for the right enemy. They had built theirs for the wrong one. This is the story of how she came to that knowledge, how she carried it across 2,000 miles of plains and prairies, how she nearly lost it twice, and how when the test came in late October of 1883, the difference between her work and her neighbor's work was measured in graves. But to tell you that story properly, we have to go back, not to Montana, to Minnesota, because Astrid Solberg did not come west by choice. She came west the way a hunted thing comes to ground, with someone behind her who wanted what was hers and only one direction left to run. Her husband had been dead for 3 weeks when the trouble started. Magnus Solberg was 34 years old when the pneumonia took him in the winter of 1881. He had been a careful man, the kind who measured twice before cutting once, and he had built a small but solid farm on the eastern edge of a Norwegian settlement near Lake Pepin. He left behind a wife, a daughter, 60 acres of cleared land, a milk cow, 2 draft horses, and a debt of $47 at the general store. He also left behind an old shepherd dog named Bjorn, who had come over from the old country in the same crate as Magnus's grandfather's wedding silver, and who had slept at the foot of Magnus's bed for 12 winters. When Magnus died, the dog stopped eating for 3 days. Astrid had to feed him broth from a wooden spoon, kneeling on the floor of the cabin, while her daughter Elsa watched from the doorway with the wide, silent eyes of a child who has just learned that her father is not coming back. Bjorn ate eventually. He understood the way old dogs understand that there was still work to do and someone still living who needed him. Astrid buried Magnus in the small Lutheran cemetery at the edge of the settlement. She wore the black wool dress she had brought from Trondheim. She did not weep at the grave because she had wept all the weeping out of herself in the 3 nights of the dying, and there was nothing left in her now but the hard, cold knowledge that she had to keep Elsa alive through whatever came next. What came next was Soren. Soren Solberg was Magnus's younger brother. He had come to America a year after Magnus, working 2 summers on the railroads before drifting back toward the Solberg farm with vague plans and emptier pockets. He was 28 years old. He had Magnus's height, but not Magnus's eyes. Where Magnus's eyes had been the color of clean lake water, Soren's were the color of lake water in February, when the surface freezes hard enough to walk on, but the current still moves dark beneath. He arrived at Astrid's door on a Tuesday afternoon less than a month after the funeral. He carried a leather satchel and wore a coat that was too thin for the season. He stood on the porch of the cabin Magnus had built with his own hands, and he did not knock. He simply waited until Astrid opened the door, and then he stepped past her into the kitchen as though he already lived there. "Sister," he said, "I have come to see about the farm." Astrid had met Soren only twice before at the wedding in Trondheim 8 years prior, and once when he passed through Minnesota in the autumn of 1880. Magnus had not spoken much of his brother, and what he had spoken had been careful, the way a man speaks of a relative he loves but does not entirely trust. Astrid set water to boil for coffee. Elsa watched from the corner, where she was mending one of her father's shirts that no longer had anyone to wear it. Soren sat at the kitchen table. He looked around the room as though appraising it. He noted the iron stove, the good pine cabinets Magnus had built, the rifle on the wall above the door, the brass lamp Astrid had brought from Norway. He nodded slowly. Then he said the words that would change every single thing. "You cannot keep this place, Astrid. A woman alone with a child. The work is too much. The winters are too hard. I have spoken with the lawyer in town. According to the laws of Minnesota, when a man dies without a written will, the property goes to his closest male relative. That is me." Astrid's hands did not shake. That was important. She would remember years later in Montana that her hands had not shaken when Soren told her she was being put off her own farm. The shaking would come later in private, where Elsa could not see it. "Magnus left a will," she said quietly. "He wrote it the autumn he became ill. It is in the bank in Red Wing." Soren smiled. It was not Magnus's smile. "I have spoken with the bank. There is no will on file in your name or his. Whatever paper you remember signing, sister, the bank does not have it. Perhaps it was lost. Perhaps it was never properly filed. Either way, the law is clear. The farm comes to me." She did not know then whether he was lying about the bank or whether he had paid someone to lose the document. She would never know. The thing that mattered was that he had been planning this since the moment he heard Magnus was dying, and she was a woman alone with a 7-year-old child in the year of our Lord, 1882, and the law was not on her side. Soren leaned forward across the table. "I will be generous, Astrid. You are my brother's wife. I will not put you out into the cold. Leave the girl with me. I will raise her as my own daughter. She will have the farm eventually when she comes of age. You may go where you please. There are positions in the town for a woman who can sew. You will have a roof. You will have work. You will have your life back." Astrid looked across the room at Elsa. Her daughter had stopped mending. The needle was held still between her small fingers. She was looking at Soren the way a young deer looks at something it does not yet know is a predator. She did not understand the words being spoken, not entirely, but she understood the room. Children always understand the room. Astrid turned back to Soren. She poured the coffee. She set the cup in front of him. She did all of this with a steadiness that surprised her later when she remembered it. "I will think on what you have said," she told him. That night, after Soren had ridden back to the boarding house in town, Astrid took Elsa onto her lap by the fire, and Bjorn lay across her feet, and she made three decisions. First, that her daughter would not be raised by Soren Solberg, not in this life or any other life. Second, that she would not stay in Minnesota and fight a legal battle she could not win. And third, that wherever she went, she would go with $60 in coin a wagon, two horses, the rifle, the brass lamp, the dog, and her child. Everything else she would leave behind: the farm, the cabinets Magnus had built, the grave under the birch trees in the Lutheran cemetery. All of it. She left at dawn 3 days later. She did not tell Soren. She did not tell the neighbors. She drove the wagon south first, then west, then northwest, across the Dakota Territory, following the railroad lines as far as they went, and then following the wagon ruts the railroad lines did not follow. She drove for 41 days. She slept under the wagon when the weather allowed and inside it when it did not. Bjorn ran alongside the horses by day and slept across the entrance at night, and any night that something moved out in the dark grass beyond the fire, Bjorn would lift his old gray head and growl low in his throat, and whatever was out there would move on. She came down out of the foothills into the Gallatin Valley in the spring of 1882 with $37 left in coin, two horses too tired to walk much further, a child who had not spoken in 11 days, and an old shepherd dog who could no longer run beside the wagon and who rode now in the back, his head on Elsa's lap. She filed her homestead claim on 160 acres that nobody else wanted. The land sat in a wind channel between two mountain ridges. The neighbors who registered her claim in Bozeman warned her that the wind there was something to be reckoned with. She nodded. She paid her filing fee. She drove the wagon out to her claim, and she stood in the long grass with Elsa beside her and Bjorn at her hip, and she looked at the land that was now hers and at the wind that was already moving the grass in long ripples toward the south. And she said only one thing: "We will build." That first summer, she built nothing. She dug. She and Elsa cut a dugout into the south face of a low rise the way she had read that other settlers did, and they lined it with sod, and they spent 4 months living half underground, while Astrid taught herself by trial and brutal error what timber would burn and what would not, where the spring water came up cleanest, what the wind did at sunrise and what it did at sunset, and how to use the rifle to bring down a pronghorn at 300 yards because $37 did not buy enough flour to last a winter. When the snow came in late November, they were ready for it, the way a woman with no experience can be ready for something she has never seen before, which is to say, not ready at all. The first winter nearly killed them 3 times. The first time was in early December, when a storm pinned them in the dugout for 9 days, and Elsa ran a fever so high that Astrid lay awake every hour pressing snow to her daughter's forehead. Bjorn lay across Elsa's small body all those 9 days, his old back giving the child the warmth that the dugout could not give her. When Elsa finally broke fever on the morning of the 10th day, Bjorn was so stiff he could not stand, and Astrid had to carry him to the fire and rub his back legs with her hands until the blood came back into them. The second time was in late January, when the firewood ran low and Astrid had to choose between burning the wagon's spare axle and burning the only book she had brought from Norway, which was her mother's Bible. She burned the Bible. She tore the pages out one by one and fed them to the small iron stove, and she kept Elsa warm for 3 more days that way, and she did not weep over it because weeping took moisture, and moisture froze on your face in that kind of cold, and the freezing on your face caused the skin to blister. The third time, and this is the time that mattered most, was on a Tuesday night in the middle of January when Astrid Solberg sat alone at the small table by the dying fire while Elsa slept and Bjorn snored softly on the floor, and she wrote a letter. The letter was addressed to Hester Ainsworth, who ran a boarding house in Bozeman and who had been kind to Astrid the one time they had met. The letter was short. It said that Astrid was sorry. It said that she had failed. It said that Elsa was a good child, smart and obedient, and that she would not be a burden to whoever raised her. It said that there was $37 buried in a tin under the dugout floor that should be used for the child's keeping. It said that Astrid was going for a walk and that she would not be coming back and that Hester should send someone for the child in the morning. Astrid folded the letter. She set it on the table. She put on her coat. She buttoned it slowly the way a person buttons a coat when they have already decided that buttoning carefully no longer matters. She went to the door of the dugout. Bjorn was already there. The old dog had risen from the floor without her hearing him. He stood between Astrid and the door, and he lowered his head, and from somewhere deep in his chest came a sound she had never heard him make before. It was not a bark. It was not a growl. It was the long, low, refusing sound of an animal who had carried this family across 2,000 miles and who would not let it end this way. Astrid stood very still. She looked down at Bjorn. The old dog looked back up at her. His cloudy eyes steady, his gray muzzle lifted, and he did not move. Bjorn, she whispered. The dog did not move. She knelt down on the dirt floor of the dugout. She put her arms around the old shepherd's neck. She pressed her face into the warm fur behind his ears, and she wept, finally, the weeping she had been refusing since Magnus died, and Bjorn stood there and let her weep into his neck for a long time, and he did not move. When she lifted her head, something her grandfather had said came back to her. Her grandfather had been a man named Olav, who lived at the northern end of a fjord where the sun did not rise from November until late January, and who kept goats in a stone byre that was attached directly to the side of his cottage. As a child, Astrid had visited him in winter, and she had not understood then why his cottage was warm when the cottages of his neighbors were cold. She had not understood why he never had to walk through a snowstorm to feed his animals. She had not understood why his firewood was always dry when other men's firewood was always damp. She had been 6 years old. She had asked him about it. And her grandfather, who had hands like tree roots and a beard that had been white for as long as anyone could remember, had laughed and said only this: "You build the house and the barn together, child, not apart. The animals warm the man, and the man warms the animals, and the wood stays dry between them, and nobody dies walking from one to the other in the dark." Astrid knelt on the dirt floor of the dugout, and her arms were around Bjorn's neck, and she remembered her grandfather's words for the first time in 24 years, and she understood finally what she was going to build. She rose. She went to the table. She picked up the letter she had written to Hester Ainsworth. She held it over the small flame in the iron stove, and she watched the paper catch and curl and turn to ash. Then she sat down at the table again, and she found the stub of a pencil, and on the back of an old flour sack she began to draw. She drew through the rest of the night. By the time the spring of 1883 came and the snow began to retreat from the fence post, Astrid had drawings spread across every flat surface of the half-built cabin she had thrown up the previous autumn. The plans showed something that no settler in the Gallatin Valley had ever seen and that none of them, she suspected, would understand. A single rectangular structure 24 feet wide and 40 feet long. A cabin at the north end. Livestock stalls wrapping around the cabin on 3 sides like a horseshoe. A firewood stack at the southern end, 16 cords deep, raised off the floor on split logs with double-walled construction and ventilation gaps to keep the wood dry. Hay storage in the loft above. A common roof over all of it. She rolled the best of the drawings carefully. She put on her traveling coat. She harnessed the bay gelding to the wagon. She drove into Bozeman with Elsa beside her and Bjorn riding in the wagon bed. And she went to the general store, and she spread her drawings across the long pine counter, and she asked the men gathered there for their opinion. The men gathered there gave her their opinion freely. Jeremiah Whitfield was the first to speak. He was 43 years old, square-shouldered from Ohio originally. He had homesteaded near Bozeman 5 years earlier. He had 4 sons, all of them tall, all of them already deferring to him the way sons defer to a father who has never once been proven wrong about anything. He stood at the counter and looked at Astrid's drawings, and his face did something complicated, the face of a man who was about to be very kind and very certain at the same time. "Mrs. Solberg," he said, "I do not wish to speak harshly to a widow, but you cannot build like this. You are placing your livestock within feet of where you sleep. The smell will drive you out of the cabin within a week. The moisture from the animal's breath will rot your timbers in 2 years. And the manure, ma'am, the manure alone. Cormac Sullivan was the second. He was a former railroad worker, an Irishman leaner than Jeremiah, and harder with the kind of forearms that came from 12 years of swinging a sledgehammer through the Rockies. He had built his own homestead 3 years prior, and he was prouder of his woodshed than he was of his rifle. He looked at the drawings for a long moment. He shook his head slowly. It is a fire trap, Mrs. Solberg. One overturned lantern in your hayloft, and you and your daughter burn alive in your own cabin. A man separates his structures for safety. That is not custom. That is not opinion. That is common sense. The third man at the counter said nothing at first. His name was Hollis Calloway. He was 31 years old, a husband, a father of 3 small boys, and Astrid's nearest neighbor. He had helped her patch the roof of her half-finished cabin the previous autumn and had refused payment for the work. He looked at her drawings now, and when he spoke, there was no mockery in his voice. There was only the quiet, careful concern of a man who liked his neighbor and did not want to see her die. Mrs. Solberg, he said, I do not want to find your bodies in the spring. Build like the rest of us build. Please, there is a reason we build the way we build. Astrid rolled up her drawings. She thanked the 3 men for their honesty. She put the rolls back under her arm. She walked out of the general store and lifted Elsa into the wagon and clicked the bay gelding into motion. She did not look back. She did not argue. There was no point in arguing with men who were certain. She drove home, and that evening she began ordering lumber. The next visitor came 2 weeks later on a warm afternoon in May. Astrid was already laying her foundation stones. Elsa was carrying water from the spring. Bjorn lay in the shade of the wagon watching the road. He lifted his head before Astrid heard the hoofbeats. The rider was a thin woman in a gray traveling dress. She rode the way a person rides who has spent decades in the saddle, neither well nor poorly, simply efficiently. She drew the horse up at the edge of the foundation stones, and she dismounted without help, and she walked across the new gravel toward Astrid with the directness of someone who has not come to make small talk. Mrs. Solberg, she said, my name is Hester Ainsworth. I run the boarding house in Bozeman. I have heard about your plans. She was 51 years old, thin as a lodgepole pine, with hair the color of iron, and eyes that did not waste themselves on pleasantries. Astrid offered her water from the bucket. Hester accepted it. They sat on 2 foundation stones in the spring sun, and Hester looked at the drawings Astrid spread between them, and for a long time she did not speak. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. I am not here to tell you what to do, Mrs. and Mrs. Solberg. I came out here to tell you something else. I have buried 2 husbands in this territory. My first husband died walking from his cabin to his barn during a blizzard in 1871. The 2 structures were 15 feet apart. They found him 3 feet from his own door, frozen solid, facing the wrong way. He had become disoriented in the white air. 3 feet, Mrs. Solberg. That was all the distance there was, and it killed him as surely as if it had been 3 miles. Astrid said nothing. Hester drank her water. She set the cup down on the stone. I do not know if your design will work. I know nothing about carpentry, but I know what kills people in Montana, and it is not the cold itself. It is the gap between a person and the thing they need. Whatever you are building here, build it so there is no gap. That is all I came to say. She rose. She mounted her horse. She paused before turning back toward town. And Mrs. Solberg, you will not have many friends in this valley building what you are building, but you will have one. If anything goes wrong, you ride to my door, day or night, and you knock. Do you understand? Astrid nodded. Hester rode away. Bjorn watched her go, his head lowered. His old gray muzzle pointed toward the road long after the rider had disappeared. The summer of 1883 was the hardest summer of Astrid's life and also the best. She raised the walls. She set the rafters. The single ridge beam was a 32-foot lodgepole pine 16 inches thick, and she could not lift it alone. She hired the only man in town who had not laughed at her drawings, a Swedish carpenter named Olof Bergman, who had grown up in the valleys north of Stockholm and who had told her the moment he saw her plans that he had seen something like them once before in his grandfather's village. Olof was 52 years old, a widower of 9 years with quiet hands and a quieter manner. He helped her rig a tripod and a block and tackle. The two of them lifted the ridge beam in a single afternoon, the kind of lift that 3 men had told her could not be done by 2. When the beam settled into its notches, Olaf wiped his forehead, looked up at the long, high spine of the new structure, and nodded once, and then he packed his tools and went back to Bozeman. Because he was a careful man and he had work of his own to do. She finished the rest herself, she and Elsa, she and the slow, patient summer, she and Bjorn lying in the shade and watching the work. By the end of September, the structure stood complete. Jeremiah Whitfield rode out one afternoon to see it finished. He walked around it twice. He went inside. He stood in the cabin portion and looked at the interior doors leading to the stalls, and his face did the complicated thing it had done in the general store, and he said finally that the carpentry was sound. He said this slowly as a man forces out words he does not wish to say. And then he said, "You will regret it come January. The smell, the moisture, the risk. Mark my words." Cormac Sullivan came out a week later. He looked at the structure for a long time. Then he said, "You have built yourself a coffin. All it takes is one spark." Hester Ainsworth came on a cool September afternoon and brought bread and butter. She walked through the corridors. She inspected the firewood storage. She climbed the ladder to the hayloft. She came down and she sat at Astrid's new table and she said, "It is solid work, Mrs. Solberg, but Winter is something else. Winter does not care how good your carpentry is." Astrid thanked her. She stocked the firewood. 16 cords, just as the design called for. She filled the hayloft. She brought the cow into her stall, and the 2 horses into theirs, and the 3 chickens into the small coop she had built into the western wall. By the last week of September, she had stocked everything she needed for a Montana winter, and her structure stood ready, and the wind came down through the channel between the ridges in the westbound slow, steady breath that meant the season was about to turn. And on the last Friday of September, a man rode up to her door. She was in the cabin when she heard the hoofbeats. Bjorn was already on his feet, the old gray hackles rising along his back. Astrid rose from the table. Elsa looked up from her school book. Astrid walked to the window and she pulled back the curtain, and the breath went out of her body in one long, slow exhalation. It was Soren Solberg. He had aged. The year and a half since Minnesota had hardened him. He sat his horse the way a man sits a horse when he has come a long way and is prepared to come further. He did not dismount. He sat there looking at the strange, long structure she had built, and a small private smile moved across his mouth, the kind of smile a man permits himself when he sees that things are going to be even easier than he had expected. Astrid opened the door. She did not invite him in. She stood on the threshold with Bjorn at her hip, and she felt Elsa come up behind her and wrap small fingers around the back of her dress. "Sister," Soren said, "I see you have been busy." "What do you want, Soren?" "I want what is mine." He swung down from the saddle. He did not approach the door. He stood in the yard, easy, casual, the way a man stands who has all the time in the world and all the law behind him. "I have spoken with a lawyer in Bozeman," he said, "a reputable man. He has reviewed the matter carefully. According to the laws of the state of Minnesota, where my brother died and where the original guardianship would have been determined, the closest male relative of a fatherless child has a recognized claim. That claim travels with the child's sister. It does not stay in Minnesota. It comes wherever the child goes." Astrid's hand tightened on the doorframe. Soren went on, "I have not come to take her today. I am a reasonable man. I am giving you the autumn. I am giving you the chance to consider. The men in the town tell me you have built your cabin wrong. They say you will not survive the winter. They say the stink of your animals will drive you out by Christmas. They say your timbers will rot. They say your firewood will get wet and your fire will go out and you will freeze to death in your foolish contraption with my brother's daughter in your arms." He paused. He let the words sit in the cold autumn air. "I do not wish that for you, sister. I do not wish that for the child. So I am giving you a choice. You may give me the girl now today and ride back to Minnesota with me. I will see her raised properly with cousins in a real house with a real future. Or you may keep her here through the winter and we will see what the winter does, and I will return in May when the pass is open and we will see what is left." He smiled again, the same private smile. "I will be back, Astrid, either to take her from your arms or to take her from your grave. The choice is yours." He mounted his horse. He turned the animal back toward the road. He rode away without another word. Astrid stood in the doorway for a long time after the dust settled. Bjorn pressed against her leg. Elsa's small hand was still wrapped in the back of her dress. The wind was moving in the long grass, that slow, patient northern wind, and somewhere far away across the valley a hawk cried once and then was silent. That evening, after Elsa was asleep, Hester Ainsworth came to the door. She had heard the way news travels in a small valley that a stranger had ridden out from town and asking after Astrid Solberg. She came in. She sat at the table. Astrid told her everything. Hester listened. When the telling was done, Hester was quiet for a long time. Then she said slowly, "Montana law may be different from Minnesota law. A sheriff here may not honor his claim, but you cannot count on that, Astrid. You cannot count on any man who carries paper from a different state. What you need is more than the law. You need this valley standing behind you. You need every neighbor who knows you to stand up when the time comes and say that this child belongs here." Astrid shook her head. "I do not need this valley, Hester. I have not asked them for anything. I will not ask them for anything. I have what I have because I built it myself." Hester looked at her across the table for a lost moment. She looked at her the way a woman looks at another woman she has come to admire and to fear for at the same time. She said only, "Pride is a fine fire, Astrid, but it does not warm a child." She rose. She went to the door. Before she left, she turned back. "You will need them, Astrid. Before the winter is done, you will need them. I hope when that day comes, you will know how to ask." And then she was gone, and the night closed in over the valley, and somewhere far up in the high passes, the first snow was already beginning to fall 6 weeks earlier than any settler in the Gallatin Valley had reason to expect. The blizzard would come on a Tuesday morning in late October. It would last 3 days and 3 nights. It would drop the temperature to 41 degrees below zero. It would drive 7 people into early graves, and it would push Astrid Solberg in the small dark hours of its second night to a question she had never thought she would have to ask. But that comes later. For now, on the last Friday of September in 1883, she stood in the doorway of the structure that the entire valley had told her was wrong, and she watched the wind move the long grass toward the south, and she did not yet know that her grandfather's old wisdom was about to be tested by something even her grandfather had never seen. She did not yet know that the winter was already moving down out of the high country to find her. She did not yet know that Bjorn, the old gray shepherd, who had carried her family across 2,000 miles, had only one great act of service left in him. She did not yet know what it would cost her to learn that she could not in the end stand entirely alone. She knew only one thing. She knew that her daughter was sleeping in the next room. She knew that her firewood was stacked dry against the southern wall. She knew that the door between her kitchen and her livestock was 8 feet from where she stood. And she knew that whatever came down out of the mountains, she would be ready. She closed the door against the dusk. She set the bar across it. She turned back into the cabin, and Bjorn followed her, and the fire in the hearth burned steady and warm, and the long Montana night came down over the valley like a slow-held breath. The snow began on a Tuesday morning in late October. Astrid was at the iron stove when she saw the first flakes through the kitchen window. She had been frying salt pork and cornmeal for breakfast, and Elsa was at the table with her wooden cup of warm milk, and Bjorn was sleeping in his usual place beside the hearth. The morning had begun like any other morning. There was a chill in the air, but Astrid had been expecting that for weeks. The wind had been moving wrong since Sunday. The horses had been restless. Bjorn had been sleeping closer to the fire than usual. She turned from the stove and looked through the window, and the first thing she saw was that the world had gone strange. The flakes were not falling the way snow normally fell. They were moving sideways, driven by a wind that had not been there at 5 in the morning when she rose. They struck the glass and held for a moment, and then were swept on. Beyond them, the long grass of the home pasture was already being pressed flat. The fence posts she could see 50 feet from the cabin were beginning to disappear in something that was not quite snow and not quite mist, but a low-blowing veil that thickened as she watched. She set down the spoon. She walked to the window. She watched for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she turned to Elsa and said in a voice that was neither louder nor softer than her usual voice, "Daughter, finish your milk. We will not be going outside today." Elsa looked up from her cup. She looked at her mother and she looked at the window, and she did not ask any of the questions a child might ask. She drank her milk. She set the cup down carefully. She climbed down from the chair and went to the corner where Bjorn was sleeping, and she sat down on the floor next to the old dog, and she pressed her small body against his side. By noon, Astrid could no longer see the fence posts. By noon on Wednesday, she could not see the front porch. By Thursday morning, the thermometer Astrid had nailed to the door frame read 32 degrees below zero, and the wind was screaming through the valley in a sound that had stopped being a breath and had started being something else, something that the old men in town would later say was not like any blizzard they had heard in 20 years. Inside the structure that the valley had spent the summer mocking, Astrid Solberg went about her morning. She rose at first light the way she always rose. She built up the fire in the stone hearth. She put on a wool shawl over her dress, and she walked the 8 feet from the kitchen to the interior door that led into the eastern stalls, and she opened it. The corridor on the other side was cold, but not killing cold. The thermometer she had hung on the inner wall of the corridor read 34 degrees above zero, cold enough to keep the firewood dry, warm enough that her breath did not crystallize in front of her face, warm enough that her hands did not numb in the moments it took her to walk down the corridor with her milking pail. She milked Greta. The short-horned cow stood patient and warm in her stall. The heat coming off the animal's hide was a steady, gentle warmth that filled the corridor and rose up through the structure and seeped by some old principle her grandfather had understood back into the cabin walls themselves. Greta gave 2 gallons that morning. Astrid carried the pail back through the corridor, through the interior door into the kitchen, and she set it on the table. She fed the chickens. 4 eggs. She climbed the ladder to the hayloft and forked down enough feed for the cow and the 2 horses. The horses, the bay gelding and the gray mare, stood placid in their stalls. They were warm. They were dry. They were eating. She loaded firewood. She walked down the corridor to the southern wall where the 16 cords stood stacked dry and patient on their raised platform. She loaded her arms with split pine and cedar enough for 3 hours of burning. She carried it back to the kitchen. She did not put on her heavy coat for any of this. She did not put on her boots. She did all of it in her wool shawl and her ordinary indoor shoes. The total time elapsed from the moment she rose from the table to the moment she returned with firewood was 20 minutes. In the cabin, Elsa was awake. She was sitting at the table with her schoolbook open in front of her. The fire in the hearth was warm. The kitchen was warm. The thermometer on the inside wall of the cabin read 68 degrees above zero. Bjorn was at her feet. Outside the cabin, the wind was screaming in a sound that the old men of the valley would later remember for the rest of their lives. Inside, a woman and a child were eating breakfast. This is what she had built. This was the thing that her 3 respected neighbors had told her was foolish. She had built it, and now the test had come, and the structure was holding. If the story ended here, it would be a quiet story about a clever woman who had built her cabin correctly. It would not be the story I am telling you. Because what Astrid Solberg did not yet know in the small hours of that first day of the storm was that her structure was not perfect. Nothing built by human hands is perfect. And on the second night of the blizzard, she would discover what her structure could not do. But before we come to that, you need to know what was happening in the other cabins of the valley. Because what was happening in those other cabins is the reason this story has any meaning at all. 3 miles east, in a cabin that had been built 5 years before by a man who knew his carpentry and his customs, in his common sense, Hollis Calloway was tying a length of rope around his waist. His wife Mirabelle watched from the kitchen. Their 3 sons were on the rug in front of the small iron stove. Wesley was 9 years old, the eldest, and he was holding his youngest brother Daniel in his lap, the 4-year-old, because Daniel had been crying, and Wesley had taken on in the way that eldest sons take things on the burden of comforting his brother. Tobias was 6, sitting between them, watching his father with the weedy, grave eyes of a child who has begun to understand that the adults in his life are afraid. Hollis had built his woodshed 40 yards west of his cabin door. In July, this was a perfectly reasonable distance. A man could walk from his cabin to his woodshed and back in 3 minutes. He could carry an armload of split logs without breaking a sweat. The 40 yards was an act of prudence, the recommended distance for keeping the smell of damp wood away from living quarters and reducing the fire risk. In a Montana blizzard, 40 yards was a sentence of death waiting to be read aloud. Hollis had already made the trip once. Yesterday at noon, when the wood inside the cabin had run low, he had tied the same rope around his waist, tied the other end to the iron handle of his front door, and walked out into white nothing with his arms outstretched. The rope was 30 feet long. The shed was 40 yards away. When the rope ran out, he had 10 yards left to go. He had unclipped himself and walked the last 10 yards, on faith, counting his steps, leaning into a wind that was trying to push him perpendicular to his own path. He had hit the wall of the woodshed with his right shoulder. He had loaded his arms until he could carry no more. He had turned and started back, following his own tracks, except his own tracks had already filled with snow. He had walked in circles for 10 minutes. The cold had begun to get into his hands. He had been about to drop the wood and run panicked in any direction when his left boot had caught the rope lying coiled in the snow. He had followed it back to his door with his arms shaking and his face going numb in patches. That had been yesterday. Today the rope was buried. The woodshed was invisible. The wind was twice what it had been yesterday, and the wood Hollis had brought back yesterday was almost gone. He had perhaps 4 hours of fuel left, maybe 5 if he kept the fire low. After that, the cabin would begin to cool, and after the cabin began to cool, he had children who would not survive the night. So he was tying a rope around his waist again. And Mirabelle was watching him, not crying, not pleading, because she had learned in 8 years of marriage that pleading did not move him when he had decided a thing. She was simply watching, memorizing him, the shape of his shoulders, the lines of his face, the way his hands worked the knot. "I will be 10 minutes, he said. She nodded. "If I am longer than 15 minutes, do not come after me." She nodded again. He turned to the boys. Wesley was looking up at him from the rug, holding Daniel against his small chest. Hollis went to him. He knelt down. He put his hand on the back of his eldest son's head, and he said quietly, so the younger boys would not hear, "You are the man here while I am gone. You stand by your mother. You watch your brothers. You do not come outside no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Wesley nodded. He was crying without sound, the way of a 9-year-old boy cries when he is trying very hard to be the man his father has just told him to be. Hollis stood. He kissed Mirabelle. He opened the door. The wind took the door out of his hand and slammed it against the wall, and a blast of white air came roaring into the cabin, and Hollis pulled himself out into the storm and pulled the door shut behind him, and the cabin was suddenly very quiet. Mirabelle sat down at the table. She did not move for a long time. The boys were quiet. The fire in the iron stove was burning low. Outside, the wind was screaming. Hollis Calloway lasted 4 minutes. "We will come back to him. We need to come back to him because what happened in the next 4 hours in that cabin is one of the things this story is about. But for now, the rope around his waist had snapped at minute two when the wind drove a sheet of frozen ice crystals across his back at a velocity that no fabric was made to bear. Without the rope, he had only his sense of direction. The white air had taken his sense of direction at minute three. By minute four, he was walking in a direction that he believed was leading him back to his own front door. He was not. He was walking perpendicular to his own porch out into the open prairie, and the cold was taking him faster than he had any way to know. He died believing he was almost home. 2 miles to the north, Cormac Sullivan was on his third trip of the day to his own barn. Cormac had built his barn 75 feet from his cabin door. He had connected the two structures with a length of stout hemp rope tied to iron rings he had set into the door frames himself. He had considered this rope when he installed it the height of winter preparedness. A man could not get lost between two structures if he had a rope to follow. The rope ran thigh-high through a series of stakes he had driven into the ground at 10-foot intervals. Most of the stakes were now buried. The rope was beginning to sag and tangle in the snow. Cormac had made 2 trips already. The first trip had taken him 15 minutes and had left him exhausted. The second trip, half an hour ago, had taken him 20 minutes, and he had returned with his face white in patches and his hands shaking too badly to set down the firewood without dropping it. His wife, Clara, had wanted him to wait. He had refused. The fire was burning low and the cold was getting into the cabin walls, and a third trip was necessary. He stepped out into the white wind for the third time. The cold came up under his coat the way cold gets under a coat in a real Montana blizzard, not as a chill, but as a kind of grasping that goes for the skin and then goes for the bone. He ducked his head into the wind and put his right hand on the rope, and he began to walk. The rope was slick with ice. His hand was already going numb inside his glove. He could feel the rope, but only barely. He made it 20 feet. He made it 30. The wind was pushing him sideways with such force that he had to lean into it at an angle that was almost impossible to hold. Halfway between the cabin and the barn, the cold reached his thinking. This is the thing the men in the saloons in Bozeman would later try to explain to people who had not been in that storm. The cold gets into a man's thinking before it gets into his body. It does not feel like cold. It feels like slowness. It feels like the world becoming simple. A man who is freezing to death stops being able to count the steps he has taken. He stops being able to remember what he was doing. He stops being able to feel his own hands. Cormac stopped walking. He stood in the white wind, his right hand wrapped around what he believed was the rope. He could feel the rope clearly. He could feel the weight of it. He could feel his fingers gripping it tight. He stood there for what he later believed was perhaps 10 seconds, but was probably closer to 30, gathering his strength to push on toward the barn. Then he looked down. He was not holding the rope. The rope had fallen from his hand at some point in the last minute, and his glove was empty, and what he had been gripping was the shape of his own numb fingers folded against each other. He had not been able to feel the difference. The cold had taken the difference away. He understood then in one cold instant that he was about to die. He spun in place. The white air was on every side of him. He could not see the cabin. He could not see the barn. He took one step in what he believed was the direction of the cabin, and he tripped over something hard and went down face first into the snow. It was the rope. He had tripped on the rope. He grabbed it with both arms and held it against his chest the way a drowning man holds a lifeline. He pulled himself along it, hand over hand, on his belly through the snow because he could no longer trust his legs. His face was numb. The skin on his cheeks felt like leather. He pulled himself for what felt like an hour but was perhaps 3 minutes, and his outstretched hand finally struck the wood of his own front porch, and he hauled himself up the steps and beat on the door with both fists because his fingers no longer worked. Clara opened the door. She took one look at his face, the white patches on his cheeks, the white at the tip of his nose, the white spreading along his jawline. She pulled him inside and she shut the door and she pushed him down into the chair by the iron stove and she went to the basin for snow to pack against the frostbite because she had heard from women who had lived in Montana longer than she had that you pack snow against frostbite to bring the blood back slowly. He sat in the chair while she worked on his face. He was shaking too hard to speak. He was thinking over and over about the moment he had looked down and realized he was holding his own numb fingers and not the rope. He was thinking that the rope had been the thing he had been most proud of, the thing he had built for exactly this moment, and the rope had been about to kill him as surely as a knife. The frostbite would never fully heal. Cormac Sullivan would carry white scars on his cheeks, in his nose, and his jawline for the rest of his life. He would look at himself in mirrors for the next 40 years, and he would remember every morning that his practical and sensible separation of structures had nearly killed him. He would remember that the woman the valley had called foolish had been right. But he did not know that yet. On the second day of the blizzard, he sat in his chair shaking, and his wife packed snow on his face and the wind kept screaming. Back in Astrid's cabin, the second night of the storm was the night that the structure failed. Not catastrophically, not in the way that Cormac and Jeremiah had predicted. There was no fire. The timbers did not rot. The smell of the animals did not drive Astrid out of the cabin. The structure held. But at 3 in the morning on Thursday night, with the wind screaming outside and the temperature in the cabin sitting at 67 degrees and Elsa asleep in her bed, Astrid woke up. Something was wrong. She lay in the dark for a moment, trying to work out what had wakened her. The fire in the hearth was burning low but steady. Bjorn was at the foot of the bed asleep. Elsa was breathing softly across the room. The sounds of the cabin were the sounds she knew. Then she felt it, a thread of cold along the floorboards. Not the cold of an unheated cabin, the cold of outside air finding its way in. She sat up. She lit a lantern. She got out of bed in her stockings and her wool nightdress, and she took the lantern and walked through the kitchen to the interior door that led into the corridor. She opened the door. She stepped through. The corridor was colder than it should have been. She walked the length of the corridor toward the southern wall where the firewood was stacked. The thermometer on the inner wall read 21 degrees above zero. It should have been 34. It had been 34 for the last 40 hours. Something had changed in the last few hours of the storm. She raised the lantern and walked along the southern wall, the long, double-walled wall where the firewood was stacked. She walked slowly. She listened. She felt for the thread of cold air with the back of her hand the way her grandfather had taught her to feel for drafts. She found it 3/4 of the way along the wall. There was a gap, a small one, perhaps the width of 2 fingers. The chinking between 2 of the lower logs of the inner wall had cracked at some point in the deep cold, and the cold air from the 4-inch dead space between the inner wall and the outer wall was now leaking into the corridor. It was not a big leak, but it was a leak, and the cold air was being pushed through it by the wind pressure outside, and over the next 24 hours, if she did not seal it, the corridor temperature would drop below freezing, and the firewood would begin to take on moisture from the cold side of the wall, and the firewood was the thing the entire structure existed to protect. This was the moment when her structure was going to be tested. She went back to the cabin. She woke Elsa. "Daughter," she said, "I need your help. Bring the lantern, bring the rags from the basket, bring the small tin of bear grease from the shelf above the stove." Elsa rose without a word. She had become in the past 2 days a child who did what her mother asked without questions. They went together back into the corridor. Astrid worked the chinking out of the gap with the point of her knife. She mixed bear grease with bits of dried grass. She forced the mixture into the gap with her fingers. She pressed rags soaked in melted lard against the inner wall. She and Elsa worked side by side in the cold corridor for nearly an hour on their knees in the lantern light, and neither of them spoke much. When they were done, Astrid pressed her hand against the patched wall. She could no longer feel the thread of cold air. She sat back on her heels. She looked at her daughter in the lantern light. Elsa was looking at her with the wide, solemn eyes she had been wearing since the storm began. The girl's small face was streaked with dust. Her hair was tangled. Her dress was smeared with bear grease. "Mama," Elsa said. "Yes, daughter. Will we die like Papa did?" Astrid felt the words go through her. She did not move for a moment. Then she set down the lantern. She gathered Elsa into her arms, and she held the small body of her child against her chest in the cold corridor of the strange structure she had built. And she said in a voice that was perfectly steady, "No, my love, we will not. Papa was sick. We are not sick. Papa did not have what we have. We have this house. We have Bjorn. We have each other. We will not die." "You are sure, Mama?" "I am sure." She carried Elsa back into the cabin. She put her daughter back into bed. She built up the fire. She sat in the chair by the hearth and she did not sleep again for the rest of the night because the patch she had made in the wall had held, but she had nearly missed it, and she understood now what she had not understood when she designed the structure. The structure was not a thing she had built once and could now trust. The structure was a thing she would have to attend to watchfully as long as she lived inside it. Her grandfather had not told her this part. Perhaps her grandfather had not known it. Perhaps he had simply done it without thinking the way old people do the things they have done for so long that the doing has become invisible to them. The storm went on. By Friday morning, the temperature outside read 41 below. The wind had veered from northwest to straight north and was driving snow into drifts that reached the eaves of some cabins. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The valley had become a single white lung breathing in and out. In Hollis Calloway's cabin, the fire had gone out. It had gone out at 4 in the afternoon on Friday. Mirabelle had stretched the wood as long as she possibly could. She had burned the green wood Hollis had not yet had time to season. She had burned the bark from the wood box. She had burned a wooden spoon. She had burned the kindling box itself. The fire had gone out anyway, and by 6 in the evening, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped below freezing. Daniel, the 4-year-old, had begun to turn blue around the lips at 7. Mirabelle had wrapped all 3 boys in every blanket and coat and shirt and scrap of fabric the cabin contained. She had pulled the mattress from her own bed and laid the boys on it close to the cold stove and piled everything she had on top of them. Wesley, the 9-year-old, was holding Daniel against his chest the way he had been holding him on the rug 2 days before, and Tobias was pressed against Wesley's back, and the 3 boys lay in a small knot of warmth that was not warm enough, and Mirabelle sat beside them in the dark cabin and listened to her children breathing, and she understood that her children were going to die unless she did something. By midnight, the cabin temperature was 12 degrees above zero. Daniel had stopped shivering. This is the thing every mother in Montana knew. A child who is freezing to death will shiver and shiver and shiver, and then at the moment when the body has begun to lose the battle, the shivering stops. The child becomes quiet. The child becomes peaceful. The child seems to be falling asleep, and the child is dying. Daniel had stopped shivering at 11:30. Mirabelle sat in the dark cabin, and she thought of something Hester Ainsworth had told her years before. Hester had said the way Hester said things in the matter-of-fact voice of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and was not done burying people, that if you were ever dying of cold, you burned the structure. You burned your chairs. You burned your table. You burned your walls if you had to. You could rebuild a chair. You could rebuild a table. You could not rebuild a child. Mirabelle rose. She went to the wall. She took down the axe. She broke up the first chair at 1 in the morning. She fed the pieces into the cold iron stove, and she lit them with the last match from her tin, and the small fire took hold, and the 4 of them, the mother and the 3 boys, gathered close around the small heat. Daniel began to shiver again at 1:30. Mirabelle wept silently while she watched her son shiver, because shivering meant her son was not dying yet. She broke up the second chair at 2. She broke up the kitchen table at 3, the table that Hollis had built for her with his own hands as a wedding gift. She did not let herself think about the table. She broke it apart at the joints and fed it into the stove. At 4 in the morning, she went to the wedding chest. The wedding chest had come over the mountains with her from Pennsylvania. It held her wedding dress, the blanket her mother had made for her on the night before her wedding, the small stack of letters Hollis had written her during their courtship, and the carved wooden cross her grandmother had given her when she left home. Mirabelle took out the dress, the blanket, the letters, and the cross. She set them on the floor. She broke up the chest with the axe. She fed it into the stove. At 5:30, the eastern sky began to gray. The wind was beginning to die. Mirabelle sat on the floor by the warm stove with her three sons. Daniel was asleep against her chest. Wesley was holding Tobias. The kitchen table was gone. All four chairs were gone. The wedding chest was gone. Mirabelle was looking at the rocking chair by the window, which had belonged to Hollis's mother, and she was preparing herself to break that chair apart next, and she did not yet know that she would not have to. At 6 in the morning on Saturday, Jeremiah Whitfield and his four sons came up the road on horseback with two pack horses loaded with split firewood, because Jeremiah had decided in his own warm cabin in the small hours of the morning that he could not live with himself if he did not check on the Calloway place. He pounded on the door. Mirabelle opened it. She did not speak. She simply pointed at the iron stove and at her three sleeping sons and at the empty corner where the table had been, and Jeremiah Whitfield, who was a hard man and a proud man, and a man who had told Astrid Solberg in the spring that her cabin was foolishly built, looked at the empty corner of Mirabelle Calloway's kitchen and began to weep. 3 miles south in a structure, the valley had spent the summer mocking a different kind of crisis was unfolding. Bjorn was failing. Astrid had noticed it in the morning. The old shepherd had been slow to rise. He had not eaten his breakfast. He had lain by the hearth all morning, his breathing shallow and rapid, and when she had knelt beside him and put her hand on his ribs, she had felt the heat coming off his old body. That meant fever, and she had felt the weakness of his pulse. That meant his heart was struggling against the cold air pressure of the storm. He was 12 years old. He had come from Norway in a wooden crate. He had walked beside the wagon across the Dakota Territory. He had stood between her and the door on the night she had nearly walked out into the snow. He had lain across Elsa's body during the fever in the dugout. And now, on the third night of the worst blizzard Montana had seen in a decade, his old gray heart was beginning to give out. She knew he would not live through another day. She sat by the hearth that night with Bjorn's head on her lap, and Elsa was asleep across the room, and the wind was screaming outside, and Astrid Solberg looked into the fire and asked herself the question she had been refusing to ask since September. Was Soren right? Was she wrong? Bjorn had carried this family across 2,000 miles, and Bjorn was dying. The structure had nearly failed last night. The blizzard had come 6 weeks earlier than any settler had reason to expect. She was 30 years old, alone in a valley where 7 men in the surrounding country were perhaps already dead from a storm. She had only just survived. Her daughter was 7 years old. Soren would come back in May. He would come back with paper, and he would come back with law, and he would come back with the news by then well known across 2 states that the Norwegian widow in the strange cabin had nearly died in her first real Montana winter. What would the sheriff say to that? What would any sheriff say? Soren was a man, and he was a relative, and he had a paper from a Minnesota lawyer, and Astrid was a woman alone, and her old dog was dead, and her structure had needed emergency repair in the middle of a storm. She thought for the first time that perhaps the right thing was to give Elsa to Soren in the spring. Not because she wanted to, not because she believed Soren would be a good father, but because perhaps Soren was right that a child needed more than what Astrid could give. A child needed safety. A child needed a community that would not call her mother a fool. A child needed a future that did not depend every winter on whether one woman had patched a wall correctly in the dark hours of a blizzard. She got up from the hearth. She went to the table. She found a sheet of paper. She sat down with a pencil and she began to write. Dear Soren, she got that far. She stopped. She set down the pencil. She sat at the table with the unwritten letter in front of her, and Bjorn was breathing slow and shallow on the rug behind her. And she put her face in her hands and she sat that way for a long time. She did not finish the letter. She wrote a second letter addressed to Hester Ainsworth, asking if she and Elsa could come to the boarding house in the spring and stay there until they decided what to do next. She did not finish that letter either. She put both unfinished letters into a tin. She closed the tin. She sat at the table in the firelight with the tin in front of her, and she did not move for a long time. That was the darkest hour of her life. Not the night Magnus had died. Not the night Soren had come to the door in Minnesota. Not the night she had stood at the door of the dugout with her coat buttoned and her boots on. The darkest hour of her life was at 4 in the morning. On the third night of the blizzard, sitting at her own table with two unfinished letters in a tin, asking herself for the first time since she had drawn the structure on the back of a flour sack, whether she had been wrong about everything. Bjorn made a sound from the rug. She turned. The old dog had lifted his head. He was looking at her, his cloudy eyes steady in the firelight, his old gray muzzle raised. He made the sound again. It was not a whine, it was a low murmur, the kind of sound he had made when she was a young woman in Minnesota, and Magnus had been alive, and Bjorn had been 3 years old. And she would come into the kitchen in the morning, and Bjorn would look up at her from his place by the stove and make exactly that sound. It was the sound he made when he was greeting her. She rose from the table. She went to him. She knelt down on the rug. She put her hand on his ribs, and she could feel his old heart beating slow and shallow against her palm. She put her face against his neck. He smelled the way he had smelled all his life. Old wool and grass and something faintly like rain on stone. She stayed with him on the rug for a much time. Toward dawn, the storm began to ease. The wind dropped first. The howling slid down to a steady whisper and then to nothing. The temperature began slowly to rise. The sky in the east began to lighten. By mid-morning on Saturday, Astrid could see the fence posts again from her kitchen window. But by then, something else was happening. She heard it from the corridor, a scraping, a slow, heavy movement from one of the eastern stalls. She rose. She went to the door. She opened it, and she walked the corridor, and she came to Greta's stall, and she understood at once what was wrong. Greta was in labor. The cow was not supposed to calve until February. The stress of the storm had moved the labor up. The shorthorn was lying on her side in the deep straw, her great chestnut flank rising and falling, her eyes wide and frightened, and the calf was coming, and it was coming wrong. Astrid could see one small black hoof showing where two hooves should have shown. The calf was breech. The calf was going to unless someone turned it. And if Greta lost the calf in the wrong position, Greta would die too. Astrid went to the stall door. She knelt beside the cow. She rolled up her sleeves. She had helped with calving in Minnesota, but only as an assistant. She had never done it alone. Her hands were steady, but the cow was huge and panicked, and the calf was wedged, and Astrid was alone, and Elsa was a child, and Bjorn was dying by the hearth. She heard a movement behind her. She turned. Bjorn was in the corridor. The old dog had risen from the rug. He had walked on legs that should not have been able to carry him the length of the kitchen and through the interior door and down the corridor. He stood now in the doorway of the stall, his old gray head lowered, his cloudy eyes fixed on Greta. The cow saw him. The cow knew him. The cow's breathing slowed. Bjorn walked into the stall. He lay down beside Greta's head. He pressed his old body against her neck. He made the low murmuring sound he had made earlier in the kitchen, the greeting sound, the sound he had been making to nervous animals for 12 years on 3 different farms in 2 different countries. The cow's breathing slowed further. The panic went out of her huge dark eyes. She lay still in the straw with the old dog pressed against her neck, and she let Astrid work. Astrid worked. She got her hand inside the cow. She found the calf. She found the second hoof folded back wrong. She straightened it. She pulled. Greta strained. The calf came in a great hot rush, slick and dark and alive, and Astrid caught it in her arms, and she cleared the membrane from its mouth, and the small black calf coughed and drew its first breath. Greta turned her great head and looked at her new calf, and her tongue came out and began to lick the small wet head, and the calf made a small high sound, and the calf was alive. Astrid sat back on her heels in the straw. She was covered in blood and birth water. Her arms were shaking. She looked at Bjorn. The old dog was still pressed against Greta's neck. His eyes were open. His breathing had stopped. Astrid did not move for a long time. Then she rose. She went to him. She knelt down. She put her hand on his ribs. There was no heartbeat under her palm. The old gray body was still warm, but the warmth was beginning to leave. He had walked the length of the corridor on legs that should not have been able to carry him. He had calmed the cow. He had given her the last of his strength when she could not have done it alone. And then he had laid himself down beside the great trembling animal, and he had stayed until the calf was breathing, and he had let go. Behind her, she heard small footsteps in the corridor. Elsa had come from the cabin. She was standing in the doorway of the stall in her nightdress, her small bare feet in the straw, her eyes very wide. She looked at the calf. She looked at Greta. She looked at Bjorn. She went to him. She sat down in the straw beside the old dog. She put her small hand on his side. She did not weep at first. She simply sat there the way a 7-year-old child sits beside a dog that has been with her every day of her life. Then she said very quietly, "He helped the calf, Mama." "Yes, daughter, he did. Like he helped us from Minnesota." "Yes, my love, like that." Elsa lay down in the straw beside Bjorn. She put her arm across his old gray body. She pressed her face into the fur behind his ears, the way Astrid had pressed her face there on the night she had been about to walk out into the snow. She lay there and she wept the small, steady weeping of a child who has lost something she has known all her life. Astrid sat beside her daughter and her dog in the straw. Greta was licking her new calf. The calf was making small, hopeful sounds. The wind outside had died. Astrid wept too, then finally the second weeping of her life. The first had been on the night Bjorn had refused to let her leave. This one was for him. She wept into her daughter's hair, and Elsa wept into Bjorn's fur, and the old dog lay still and warm between them. And somewhere outside the structure, the snow was beginning to settle, and the world was beginning to go quiet, and the long, terrible storm was finally ending. She buried him that afternoon. She wrapped him in a wool blanket Magnus had brought from Norway. She dug a grave at the foot of the hill behind the structure in the only ground she could find that the storm had left soft enough to dig. She set a flat stone over the grave. She did not mark it. She did not need to. She knew where it was. When she came back inside, she found Elsa at the kitchen table. The girl had brought the calf into the corner of the kitchen, wrapped in straw because the calf was too small and weak to be left in the stall. The calf was sleeping. Elsa was watching it. "What will we call him?" "Oh, him," Elsa asked. Astrid looked at the small black calf. She looked at her daughter. "That is for you to decide, daughter." Elsa thought for a long moment. "I want to call him Magnus." Astrid did not trust herself to answer for a moment. Then she said, "That is a good name." She went to the table. She picked up the tin where she had put the 2 unfinished letters. She opened the lid. She took out the letter to Soren and the letter to Hester. She looked at them in her hand for a moment. Then she walked to the hearth and she dropped both letters into the fire, and she watched them catch and curl and turn to ash. Outside, a long way across the valley, 3 pack horses loaded with firewood were making their way through deep snow toward a cabin where a woman had just begun to dismantle the rocking chair her dead husband's mother had sat in for 40 years. Astrid did not know that yet. She did not know that 7 people had died in 3 days. She did not know that her closest neighbor had been dead in the snow for 18 hours. She did not know that the news of her survival was about to begin moving through the valley, household by household, in the slow, stunned way that news of survival moves after a great storm. She knew only that her daughter was alive, that the calf was breathing, that Greta was nursing him in the corner of the kitchen, that the long, terrible storm was over, that her old dog was buried under a stone behind the hill, and that Soren Solberg, somewhere far away in a town she would not name, had heard news of the storm by now and was already beginning to make his arrangements. He would come back. She knew that he would come back sooner than May. But for one quiet hour on the afternoon of the day the blizzard ended, Astrid Solberg sat at her table with her daughter and watched a small black calf sleep in the firelight, and she did not yet have to think about what was coming next. That hour was the calm before the second storm. The second storm would not come from the sky. The first man came on Sunday morning. Astrid was at the kitchen table feeding warm milk to the small black calf with a rag dipped in a wooden cup when she heard the hoofbeats on the road. Elsa was asleep in the chair by the hearth, her head on her arms. Greta was in her stall lowing softly for her calf. The world outside was bright with new sun on new snow, and the wind had been silent for almost a full day, and the silence after the storm was the strange ringing silence that comes when a sound a person has been hearing for 3 days finally stops. She rose. She went to the window. She pulled back the curtain. Jeremiah Whitfield was riding up the long approach to her structure on a chestnut gelding. He was alone. He sat the horse the way a man sits a horse when he has not slept in 2 days. His face was gray with cold and exhaustion. His 4 sons were not with him. He had left them at home with their mother. He had ridden over the ridge from the Callaway place where he had spent most of the previous 24 hours, and the ride had taken him a long time because the snow was deep and his horse was tired. Astrid set down the cup. She walked to the door. She opened it. Jeremiah dismounted slowly. He stood in front of his horse for a moment, holding the reins in his gloved hand. He did not come up the steps. He looked up at her from the yard, and his face did something she had never seen a man's face do before. It was not the complicated face he had made in the general store in May, the face of a man who was about to be very kind and very certain at the same time. It was a face that had given up being kind and given up being certain at the same time. "Mrs. Solberg," he said. "Mr. Whitfield." He stood in the snow for a long moment, and then he said the words he had ridden over the ridge to say. "Hollis Callaway is dead. Mary Beaumont is dead. Mary Beaumont's child is dead. Old Henrik Olsen is dead. The Peterson child is dead. The Wallace child is dead. A traveling preacher whose name I do not know is dead. 7 people, Mrs. Solberg. 7 people in 3 days. The valley has not seen anything like it in 20 years. Astrid stood in the doorway. She did not speak. Jeremiah looked down at his hands. He looked at the reins in his gloved fingers. He looked back up at her, and when he spoke again, his voice was the voice of a man who has come a long way in a short time, and the distance has not been measured in miles. "My family is well. My sons are well. My wife is well. We had wood enough. We had rope enough. We had luck enough. But Mrs. Solberg, my eldest boy, my Caleb, lost sight of his brother in the white air on the second day. They were 10 feet apart with a rope between them, and the wind took the rope sideways. And Caleb thought he had lost his brother, and his brother thought he had lost Caleb, and they stood 10 feet apart in the storm, screaming each other's names for almost 2 minutes before they found each other again." He paused. 2 minutes, Mrs. Solberg. My boys could have died 10 feet from each other, with a rope between them, with 4 men in the family taking turns. We are a careful house. We are a prepared house. We were 10 feet from losing one of my sons." He looked up at the long, low structure behind her, the strange horseshoe shape of it, the single ridge running its length, the smoke rising steady from her chimney. "You did not lose anyone. I lost my dog." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. He took off his hat. He held it against his chest the way a man holds his hat at a graveside. "I am sorry for your dog, Mrs. Solberg. I am told he was an old one. He came from Norway. That is a long way for a dog to come." She nodded. She did not trust herself to say more. Jeremiah stood in the snow with his hat in his hand. The chestnut gelding shifted its weight. Somewhere across the valley, a crow called once and was answered. "I came to ask your forgiveness," he said. I came to ask if you would consider when the spring comes advising me on how to rebuild. I have a woodshed 40 yards from my cabin. My eldest son nearly died because of it. I am 43 years old, Mrs. Solberg, and I have been wrong about something fundamental for 15 years, and I would like to be wrong no longer. I will pay you whatever you ask. Astrid looked at him from the doorway. She had imagined this moment in the long July evenings when she had been laying her foundation stones with a kind of small bitter pleasure. She had imagined Jeremiah Whitfield coming to her and admitting he had been wrong. She had imagined how the pleasure would feel. It did not feel the way she had imagined. There was no pleasure in it at all. There was only a very tired man standing in the snow with his hat in his hand asking a question he had not been raised to know how to ask. "You will not pay me, Mr. Whitfield," she said. "I will help you when the spring comes if you still want my help then. There is no charge for it." He bowed his head. He stood that way for a moment. Then he put his hat back on and he mounted his horse and he rode away down the long approach without looking back. Astrid closed the door. She went to the chair by the hearth. She sat down beside her sleeping daughter. She watched the small black calf in the corner. She watched the fire. She did not weep. The weeping had all gone out of her in the corridor with Bjorn. There was nothing left now but the slow, tired understanding that the valley had begun in the silence after the storm to come to her. The second visitor came on Sunday afternoon. Cormac Sullivan rode up alone. His face was wrapped in white cotton bandages from the bridge of his nose down across his cheeks and along his jawline. Only his eyes and his mouth showed through. His eyes had the strange flat look of a man who has been through a thing he had not believed he would survive. He led a pack horse loaded with split cedar and pine. He did not dismount. He sat on his horse at the edge of the yard and he called Astrid out to him because he did not, he said, want to track snow and exhaustion into her clean kitchen. She walked out to him. She did not bring a coat. The sun was high and the air was almost warm by Montana standards. "Mrs. Solberg," he said. "Mr. Sullivan." He did not look at her face. He looked at a point on her shoulder the way a proud man looks at a person he has wronged. "I called your structure a coffin," he said. "I called it a coffin in May at the general store with 3 other men listening. I want you to know that I remember saying it. I want you to know that I have not stopped and thinking about it since Wednesday afternoon when I stood in a blizzard holding what I thought was a rope and was actually my own numb fingers." He paused. The bandages moved with his breath. "I have brought you the wood off my pack horse. It is good cedar and good pine. I split it myself this autumn. I do not need it. You do not need it either. I know you do not, but I needed to bring something. I needed to come here and stand in your yard and say the thing out loud." He looked at her finally. His eyes above the bandages were wet. "I called your house a coffin. The coffins were the rest of ours. Mine just looked more conventional." Astrid stood in the snow in her dress and her shawl. She looked up at the man on the horse. She thought about the night in the corridor when she had patched the wall with bear grease in the lantern light. She thought about how close her own structure had come to failing and how no one would ever know how close because no one had been there to see it, but Elsa and Elsa would never speak of it. She said only, "I am glad you are alive, Mr. Sullivan." He nodded. He could not speak. He turned his horse and he led the pack horse around the side of the structure and he untied the wood and stacked it himself against the southern wall in the small lean to Astrid had built for spillover firewood. He took 20 minutes to do it. When he was done, he mounted his horse again, and he rode away without coming back to the door because a proud man can only do so much in one afternoon. The third visitor came on Monday morning, and this was the one that nearly broke Astrid open. It was Mirabelle Calloway. She came on foot. She was wearing a black wool dress and a black shawl, and she was leading her 2 younger boys by the hand, and Wesley, the eldest, the 9-year-old, was carrying a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Mirabelle's face was the color of paper. She had not slept properly since Saturday morning When Jeremiah Whitfield had come to her door with the firewood, and she had taken him out to the porch and pointed at the empty space beyond the fence where the rope had ended, and Jeremiah had ridden out into the snow with two of his sons, and they had found Hollis after an hour of looking, and they had carried him home, and Mirabel had washed him herself and laid him on the bed. The road from the Calloway place to Astrid's structure was 3 miles. Mirabel had walked it carrying her grief with 3 small boys beside her because she had not known what else to do. Astrid saw them coming from the kitchen window. She went out into the yard. She did not run, but she walked quickly. She met them at the gate. She looked at Mirabel's face and she did not say anything because there was nothing in any language she knew that could be said to a woman whose husband had died walking 17 feet from his own door. She opened her arms. Mirabel walked into them without speaking. The 2 women stood in the snow at the gate holding each other, and Mirabel did not weep because Mirabel had wept all the weeping out of herself in the small dark hours of Saturday morning. The 3 boys stood in a small huddle behind their mother. Wesley was holding the bundle of oilcloth tight against his chest. Tobias was holding Daniel's hand. None of them spoke. Astrid brought them inside. She sat them at the kitchen table. She gave the boys warm milk and bread and butter. She gave Mirabel hot coffee. She did not ask any questions. She built up the fire. She moved her around the cabin the way a woman moves when she has guests who need to be left alone for a while inside their own quiet. Elsa was awake by then. She came out of the bedroom in her dress, and she saw the 3 Calloway boys at the table, and she went to Wesley first because Wesley was the closest in age to her, and she took his hand the way children take each other's hands when adults have gone past the point where adults can help. "Do you want to see the calf?" Elsa asked. Wesley nodded. He was 9 years old, and he had been the man of his house for 2 days, and he was very tired. He let Elsa lead him to the corner where the small black calf was sleeping. Tobias and Daniel followed. The 4 children sat on the floor around the calf, and Elsa told them in her serious child's voice that the calf's name was Magnus, and that he had been born in the storm, and that an old dog from Norway had helped him live. The boys listened. Daniel reached out and put his small hand on the calf's flank. At the kitchen table, Mirabel finally spoke. "He kissed me before he went out, Astrid. He kissed me and he kissed each of the boys, and he said he would be 10 minutes. Astrid sat across from her. She did not interrupt. "He said if he was longer than 15 minutes, I should not come after him. He said it twice. He made me promise, and I promised. So when 15 minutes went by, I sat at the table and I waited. And when 30 minutes went by, I sat at the table and I waited. And the fire began to die, and I knew Astrid. I knew at minute 32 that he was dead, but I had promised." She looked across at Astrid. Her eyes were dry. "I broke up the chairs first, then the table he made me as a wedding gift, then his mother's wedding chest. I burned everything we had built our marriage on, Astrid, to keep my children alive. You did the right thing. I burned my mother's blanket. You did the right thing, Mirabel." He had carved a heart into the corner of the table the first year we were married. I did not look at the corner before I broke it. I am ashamed of that. I broke the table without looking. Mirabel: "Yes. Hollis would have wanted you to break the table." Mirabel was quiet for a long moment. "I know that, Astrid. I know it in my mind, but my heart will not yet learn it." Astrid reached across the table. She took Mirabel's cold hand in her own. They sat that way for a long time, and no one spoke, and the 4 children played quietly with the small black calf in the corner, and the fire burned low and warm in the hearth. After a while, Wesley came over to the table with the bundle of oilcloth. He stood very straight beside his mother. He held out the bundle to Astrid. "This was Pa's," he said. "Ma said you should have it." Astrid took the bundle. She unwrapped the oilcloth carefully. Inside was a hammer, a good claw hammer with a hickory handle, the head dark with use, the kind of hammer a man uses for 30 years and then passes on. "He patched my roof with this," Astrid said. I know, Wesley said. He told me about it. He said you were a hard worker. He said most folks would have hired the work, but you climbed up there with him and you handed him the nails one by one. He said you did not flinch on the ridge beam. Astrid held the hammer in her hands. She closed her eyes. Thank you, Wesley. Yes, ma'am. The Callaways stayed until after the noon meal. Astrid fed them all. Mirabel did not eat much, but the boys ate everything she put in front of them. When they rose to go, Astrid told Mirabel quietly at the door that there was a place at her table for them every Sunday from now until Mirabel told her otherwise. Mirabel nodded. She did not speak. She gathered her boys and she walked back down the long road toward her empty house. Astrid stood in the doorway and watched them go until they were small, dark shapes against the white snow. Then she closed the door. Hester Ainsworth came on Tuesday. She rode out Framtown without sending word ahead. She arrived in the late afternoon with the sun already beginning to drop toward the western ridge. Astrid heard the horse and went to the door. Hester dismounted. She came up the steps. The two women looked at each other for a moment, and then Hester walked past her into the kitchen and sat down at the table without taking off her coat. Astrid poured coffee. Hester drank it. She set down the cup. How much wood did you burn, Astrid? 4 cords, maybe a little less. How many trips outside? None. Hester nodded slowly. She looked into her coffee for a long time. Hollis Calloway is dead. Mary Beaumont and her child are dead. Old Henrik Olsen is dead. 2 children are dead. A traveling preacher is dead. 7 people, Astrid. 7 graves to dig when the ground softens. I know. And you are sitting here drinking coffee. I am. Hester looked up. Her eyes were the color of iron. They were also wet. You were not foolish, Astrid. We were foolish. The whole valley has been foolish for 12 years. We have been building like men in Pennsylvania and like men in Ohio and like men in places that do not have Montana winters, and we have been losing 1 or 2 people a year to it, and we have been calling that losing acceptable. You have shown us what acceptable was costing us. She paused. I am too old to rebuild my boarding house, but I will tell every settler who comes through my door for the rest of my life that the strange cabin out in the Solberg place is the cabin to study before you build. I will tell them that if they laugh, they should remember that 7 people died in 3 days and the woman in the strange cabin lost a dog. I lost more than a dog, Hester. I know that, child. The 2 women sat in silence. The sun moved further toward the ridge. The light in the kitchen turned gold. After a long time, Hester said, He is coming back. I know. Sooner than May. I have been thinking that. He has heard of the storm by now, Astrid. He has heard that you survived it. He will not be pleased. A man like Soren Solberg counts on the winter to do his work for him. You have taken the winter away from him. He will come now. He will come before the spring. I have been thinking that too. Hester reached across the table and took Astrid's hand. You will need this valley, Astrid. You will need Jeremiah Whitfield and Cormac Sullivan and Mirabel Calloway and me and a sheriff and anyone else we can find who will stand up and speak. You cannot fight him alone. You cannot keep your daughter alone. The law is not on the side of women alone. The law is on the side of men with paper unless other men with reputations stand against them. Astrid looked across the table. I told you in September, Hester. I do not need this valley. I have what I have because I built it myself. Hester squeezed her hand. You buried the dog yourself too, Astrid. You patched the wall yourself. You delivered the calf yourself. There is no one in this country who will say you did not earn what is yours by your own hands. But pride is not a coat that keeps a child warm in a courtroom. When he comes, you cannot stand at the door alone. You have to let us stand with you. Do you understand? Astrid did not answer for a long time. Then she said slowly, I do not know how to ask Hester. I have never asked anyone for anything in my life. I do not know the words. The words do not matter. You only have to open the door." Hester rose. She buttoned her coat. She went to the door. Before she left, she turned back. "Send Elsa to me when he comes. Send a rider. Any rider. I will be there before the sun goes down. And I will bring others." Then she was gone, and the gold light was fading from the kitchen, and Astrid sat alone at the table for a long time looking at the small black calf in the corner where Bjorn had once slept. Soren Solberg came back on the last Friday of November. The snow had melted enough that the road into the valley was passable again. The high passes were still closed, but the road from Bozeman was clear. Soren rode up the long approach to Astrid's structure on a hired horse, and beside him rode two other men. The first man was a lawyer. He was a thin gray gentleman in a black wool coat, riding awkwardly, the way a man rides who spends most of his time at a desk. He carried a leather satchel of papers across his lap. His name was Mr. Halloran. He was from Bozeman, and he was, for the modest fee Soren had paid him, willing to travel out into the country to assist in a guardianship matter. The second man rode a heavy bay horse, and he was not a lawyer. His name was Garrick Holloway. He was the sheriff of Gallatin County. He was 47 years old, broad-shouldered, with a steady set to his mouth that suggested he had not come along willingly, but had come along because the law required certain proceedings to be witnessed by the law. Astrid saw them coming from the kitchen window. She did not panic. She did not weep. She picked up Elsa from the chair where she had been mending a stocking, and she held her daughter for a moment, and she said, "Daughter, run to the south fence. Take the bay gelding. Ride to Maribel. Tell her the man from Minnesota is here. She will know what to do. Then ride to Hester. Then come home." Elsa did not ask any questions. She put down the stocking. She put on her coat. She went out the back door of the cabin, into the corridor, and out through the small side door Astrid had built into the western stalls, and she ran across the snow to the south pasture where the bay gelding was grazing. Astrid watched her through the side window. She watched her daughter swing up onto the horse bareback the way Astrid had taught her to ride that summer, and ride at a trot down the back trail toward the Calloway place. Then she turned to the front door and she opened it, and she stepped out onto the porch as the three men rode up to the gate. Soren dismounted first. He smiled. It was the same private smile he had smiled in September. "Sister." "Soren." He walked up the path. He stopped at the foot of the steps. He looked up at her. "You are alive. I am alive." "That is good. That is good. I had heard you know. Word travels. 7 dead in this valley, they say. A great storm, the worst in a generation. And yet here you stand. I am pleased." "What do you want, Soren?" His smile did not change. "I want what is mine. I told you in the September I would return. The winter has come and on in its first violence. I see no need to wait for May. I have brought Mr. Halloran, who is a respected lawyer in Bozeman, and I have brought Sheriff Holloway because the law requires that a guardianship transfer be witnessed by an officer of the county. We have come for the child Astrid. We will not stay long. The roads will close again soon. I would like to be on the train to Minnesota by Wednesday." Astrid stood on the porch. She did not move. She did not speak. The lawyer dismounted. He came up the path with his satchel. He bowed slightly to Astrid. "Mrs. Solberg, I do not wish this to be unpleasant. I have here the papers establishing Mr. Soren Solberg's claim to guardianship of the minor child Elsa Solberg, daughter of the late Magnus Solberg. The claim is properly executed. The state of Minnesota recognizes it. Mr. Solberg is the closest male relative of the child. The matter is straightforward." Sheriff Holloway dismounted last. He walked up the path slowly. He stopped at the foot of the steps beside Soren. He took off his hat. "Mrs. Solberg." "Sheriff, I am sorry to come to your door with this matter. I want you to know that I have read the papers, and the papers appear to be in order. Minnesota law and Montana law are not the same on these matters, but a properly executed guardianship from another state is generally honored. I do not have grounds of my own to refuse the request. He paused. He looked at her steadily. But I will tell you this. If you have objection, you are entitled to make it. If you have witnesses, you are entitled to call them. I will hear what is said before I act. I will not take the child from this porch on a paper alone, not without giving you the chance to speak. Astrid looked at the three men at the foot of her steps. The lawyer with his satchel, Soren with his small smile, the sheriff with his hat in his hand. She looked beyond them, down the road. Where the road bent around the western ridge and disappeared, she could not see anyone coming. She thought for a small black moment that Elsa might not have reached Mirabel in time, that Mirabel might be away from her cabin, that the bay gelding might have thrown a shoe, that Hester might be unreachable or sick or absent, that she was going to stand on this porch alone in front of three men, and that the law was going to take her daughter from her, and that there was nothing she could do. Then she thought of Bjorn. She thought of the old gray shepherd standing between her and the door of the dugout on the night she had been about to walk into the snow. She thought of the low, refusing sound he had made. She thought of his old body pressed against Greta's neck in the stall while the calf was being born. She thought of how he had given the last of himself in the end, not to himself, but to another. She thought for the first time that Hester had been right. That pride was a fine fire, but it did not warm a child. That she had been refusing all her life to ask for anything from anyone, and that the refusing had been a kind of pride that she had carried like a coat, and that the coat was not going to keep Elsa warm in a courtroom. She straightened. She looked at Sheriff Holloway. I would like to wait, Sheriff. I have witnesses I would like to call. I have asked for them. They will come. I would ask you to wait an hour. I will wait an hour, Mrs. Solberg. Soren laughed. Witnesses, sister. To say what? That you have built a strange house, that you survived a storm. The papers are clear. The lawyer has explained them. I will wait, Sheriff, Astrid said again, looking only at the sheriff and not at Soren. I have said I will wait an hour. The four of them stood in the cold November sun. The lawyer cleared his throat awkwardly. Soren paced a few steps and lit a thin cigar. The sheriff stood with his hat in his hand and his face turned toward the road. Mirabel came first. She came riding hard on her late husband's gray mare. She came down the road from the east, and she had Wesley behind her on the horse holding to her waist, and she had not stopped to put on a proper coat. She rode up to the gate, and she dismounted, and she lifted Wesley down, and the two of them walked up the path to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps beside Astrid's structure. Mirabel did not speak to Soren. She did not speak to the lawyer. She walked up to Sheriff Holloway and she said in a voice that was perfectly clear, Sheriff, my name is Mirabel Calloway. My husband Hollis died in the storm 3 weeks ago. I have 3 sons. The youngest is 4 years old. He almost died in that storm. I am here because Astrid Solberg is the woman who shows me every Sunday now what a Montana winter does not have to look like. I am here because if Astrid Solberg had not built her cabin the way she built it, I would have buried 2 children that week instead of buried 1 husband. I am here to say that this child she has raised here belongs in this valley with her mother in the house that her mother built. Wesley stood very straight beside his mother. He was looking at Soren. Cormac Sullivan came next. He rode in from the north alone. He still wore the white bandages across his face. He dismounted at the gate. He walked up the path slowly. He stopped at the foot of the steps. He turned to the sheriff. He pulled the bandages down off his cheeks. The frostbite scars were white and raised against the skin around them. Sheriff Holloway, my name is Cormac Sullivan. I built my own homestead 3 years ago. I built my woodshed 75 feet from my cabin door, the way every man in this valley builds it. I nearly died on a rope in that storm. I would have died except I tripped on the rope when I had already lost it. I have these scars on my face for the rest of my life to remind me that the woman standing on that porch was right when the rest of us said she was wrong. Mrs. Solberg saved her own life and her daughter's life by her own work. There is no man in this valley who has earned the right to that child more than she has. Jeremiah Whitfield came next with his wife behind him on a second horse. They had come together. He dismounted. He walked up the path. He took off his hat. He stood in front of the sheriff. Sheriff Holloway, Jeremiah Whitfield, 43 years old, Bayeda, 5 years on my homestead, 4 sons. I told this woman in May that her cabin was foolishly built. I was wrong. I will say it again in front of any man in this county who wishes to hear it. I was wrong. My eldest boy nearly died 10 feet from his brother in that storm with a rope between them, while Mrs. Solberg here did not step outside her door for 3 days. There is a thing I learned in this storm, Sheriff. Some men know how to build for the country they live in. Most men do not. This woman is one of the ones who does. The valley needs her. We do not need a Minnesota lawyer telling us who can keep a child. Hester Ainsworth came last. She came in her traveling dress and her gray shawl on the same horse she had ridden out the previous afternoon. She did not dismount at the gate. She rode all the way up to the foot of the porch steps. She looked down at Soren from the saddle. She did not look at him with anger. She looked at him the way an old woman looks at a man she has met many times before in different forms across a long life. Mr. Solberg, my name is Hester Ainsworth. I am 51 years old. I have buried 2 husbands in this territory. I run the boarding house in Bozeman. I have lived in this valley for 12 years. I know every family in 20 miles. I know who is competent and who is not. I know who has earned the right to call themselves a Montanan and who has not. She paused. I have known your sister-in-law for 2 years. I have watched her dig a dugout with her own hands. I have watched her build a cabin when no one would help her. I have watched her bury a husband she could not bring with her and a dog she could. I have watched her teach her daughter to ride to read and to keep her hands from freezing in a Montana wind. She turned her head finally to Sheriff Holloway. Sheriff, I have never once in 12 years of running my boarding house come to you to ask for a thing. I am asking now. The state of Minnesota does not know this valley. The state of Minnesota did not lose 7 people in that storm. The state of Minnesota does not understand what it took for this woman to keep her child alive. If you take Elsa Solberg off this porch on the strength of a Minnesota paper, you will be making a decision that this valley will remember and not kindly. I am asking you in the name of the work that is done in this country by the women of this country to refuse the request. Sheriff Holloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Soren. Mr. Solberg, the papers you have presented are properly executed in the state of Minnesota. I will not contest that. But this is the Montana Territory. The laws of this territory grant a county sheriff a measure of discretion in matters of guardianship, particularly where the welfare of the child is contested by credible local witnesses. I have heard the witnesses. They are credible. 4 of them are my neighbors of long standing. The 5th is the woman who runs my boarding house, who has more sense than most of the men in my county. He paused. He looked at Soren steadily. I will not authorize the transfer of the child. If you wish to contest my decision, you may file in territorial court. The next session in Bozeman is in March. You are welcome to remain in town until then at your own expense, or you may return to Minnesota and engage counsel from there. But the child is not leaving this porch with you today. Not next week, not before March at the earliest. The lawyer cleared his throat. Sheriff, I must protest. Protest noted, Mr. Halloran, filed with the county clerk on Monday. Soren stood very still in the snow. The cigar had gone out in his hand. He looked up at Astrid on the porch. He looked at the 4 neighbors and the old woman on horseback. He looked at Mirabelle Calloway in her widow's black with her 9-year-old son standing straight beside her. He smiled the small, private smile one last time, but the smile no longer fit his face. This is not over, sister. It is over, Soren. I will return. You will not. You may file paper in any court you wish. You may send any lawyer you wish, but you will not return to this valley. You will not be welcome here. No man here will sell you a meal. No man here will rent you a horse. No man here will guide you to my door. You came once on a December, and once on a September, and once on a November. You will not come a fourth time. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned. He mounted his horse. The lawyer mounted his. They rode away down the long approach to the road, and Sheriff Holloway lingered for a moment to see them out of sight, and then he tipped his hat to Astrid and to Hester and to the others, and he rode after them. Astrid stood on the porch. She did not move for a long time. Mirabelle came up the steps. She put her arm around Astrid's shoulders. The two widows stood together in the November sun. I did not know how to ask, Mirabelle, Astrid said. I have never known how to ask. You did not have to ask, Astrid. We came. I sent Elsa. Elsa came riding a horse bareback into my yard at a full gallop, Astrid. She knew how to ask. Astrid laughed. It was the first laugh she had laughed in a long time. It came up out of her ragged and surprised, and Mirabelle laughed too, and Hester laughed from the saddle, and Cormac Sullivan made a small choke sound through his bandages that was the closest he could come to laughter. And even Jeremiah Whitfield, standing in the snow with his hat in his hand, allowed his hard mouth to soften into something that was almost a smile. Elsa came riding back over the ridge an hour later. She had Daniel Calloway behind her on the bay gelding because she had picked him up at the Calloway place on her way home. She rode into the yard and she dismounted and she walked up the steps to her mother and she said, Mama, did the men come? They came, my love. Did they leave? They left. For good. Astrid knelt down. She put her hands on her daughter's small shoulders. She looked into her face. For good, daughter. Elsa nodded the way a child nods when an adult tells her something she has already worked out for herself. Then she went into the house to check on the calf. That night, with the company gone home and Elsa asleep, Astrid sat at her kitchen table. She had a sheet of paper in front of her. She had the stub of a pencil in her hand. She wrote one letter. It was addressed to Soren Solberg. It said only this: Magnus left a will. It is in a safety deposit box at the First National Bank of Red Wing in the name of Astrid Solberg. The bank manager is Mr. Edmund Kerr, who took the deposit himself and remembers it well. I have written him this morning to instruct him to release the will to Sheriff Holloway, who will send it to the Territorial Court in Bozeman. The will leaves the farm in Minnesota to me for the use of Elsa upon her majority. You have until spring to vacate the property. After that, I will instruct the sheriff in Goodhue County to remove you. Do not write to me again. Do not come to this valley again. We are done. She did not sign it, sister. She signed it in her plain, steady hand, Astrid Solberg. She sealed the envelope. She put it on the mantel. She would take it to town in the morning. The truth of the will, which she had carried in her chest since Minnesota and never spoken of to anyone, was simply this. Magnus had written it carefully in the autumn before he died. He had put it in the bank himself in her name only because he had known his brother and he had known what his brother would trade. He had told her where it was on the night before he died when he was already too weak to hold a pen. She had held the knowledge for almost 2 years, and she had not used it because using it would have meant returning to Minnesota and standing in a courtroom alone. And she had been too afraid in the months after Magnus died to imagine doing that. She was not afraid now. She sat for a long time at the table with the firelight on her face. Then she rose and she went to the bedroom and she lay down beside her sleeping daughter and she slept. The spring of 1884 came late, but it came. By the 1st of May, 11 families in the Galway Valley had begun to modify their structures along the lines of Astrid's design. Cormac Sullivan was the first. He pulled down his old separated woodshed and rebuilt it as a covered corridor connecting his cabin to his barn. He came to Astrid with sketches 3 times that spring, and she went over them with him at her own kitchen table, and she did not charge him $1. Jeremiah Whitfield was second. His new structure was not a horseshoe like Astrid's because his cabin already stood and he could not tear it down. But he ran a long covered corridor from his cabin to his barn and built a firewood storage room inside the corridor, and he changed the door of his cabin so that he could reach the firewood without going outside. His wife told him afterward that the new design saved her marriage because it meant she no longer had to listen to him swear about wet wood every January. Mirabelle Calloway built a new cabin in the spring. She built it to Astrid's plan with a horseshoe of stalls around a central living quarters. Astrid and Elsa came every day for a month and helped raise the walls. Wesley, who was now 10, learned to swing a hammer that spring. He learned it from his mother and from Astrid and from the memory of his father's hands. He kept his father's claw hammer for the rest of his life. He used it to build his own house 20 years later. 3 families in the valley refused to change their construction. They did not believe what one storm had taught the rest. The next winter, 2 of those 3 families lost members to a smaller storm in February. The 3rd family sold out and moved back east in 1886. Astrid received a letter from Edmund Kerr at the First National Bank of Red Wing in April. The will was on file. Soren had vacated the Minnesota property in March. The farm had been placed in trust for Elsa, with Astrid as a trustee until Elsa's 21st birthday. Astrid wrote back instructing Mr. Kerr to lease the property to a Norwegian family she had known in the old settlement, the Lundgrens, who had 3 children of their own and who had always been kind to Magnus. The lease income after the cost of upkeep and a small payment to Mr. Kerr for his trouble came to $112 a year. Astrid used it to buy 2 more milk cows and a span of oxen. She married a man in 1887. His name was Olaf Bergman. He was the Swedish carpenter who had helped her raise the ridge beam in the summer of 1883. He had come back to her cabin twice in the years after the blizzard, the first time to help her replace a section of southern wall chinking in the spring of 1885, and the second time in the autumn of 1886 to repair a hayloft beam that had cracked in a hard freeze. Each visit had been longer than the work required. Astrid had not noticed at first. Elsa had noticed before her mother did. He came to her cabin one Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1887 with a bunch of wildflowers in his rough hand and an awkward speech he had been rehearsing for 3 weeks. Astrid heard him out. She was 34 years old. She had been alone for 6 years. She had Elsa, who was now 11, and the small structure that had become a respected curiosity in the valley, and a calf named Magnus, who was now a 4-year-old steer. She thought about Olaf's offer for 2 days. Then she said yes. They were married at the boarding house in Bozeman, with Hester Ainsworth presiding over the wedding supper, and Mirabelle Calloway as Astrid's witness, and the Whitfield boys as ring bearers, all 4 of them, because no one could choose between them. They had 2 more children together, a son they named Magnus, who would grow up to be a doctor in Helena, a daughter they named Greta after the cow, which Elsa had insisted upon. Bjorn II, who had come from the Calloway household as a puppy in the spring of 1884, lived for 15 years. He was the best stock dog the valley had ever seen. When he died in 1899, Astrid buried him beside the first Bjorn at the foot of the hill behind the structure. The 2 stones lay side by side under the grass. Elsa Solberg grew up. She went to school in Bozeman from the age of 9. She was the best student her teacher had ever had. She left the valley at 18 to attend the Territorial Normal School. She came back at 22 as a certified teacher. She taught school in Bozeman for 40 years. She married a man named Thomas Howell, who was a railroad engineer. They had no children of their own, but Elsa was the favorite aunt of every child in the Gallatin Valley for 2 generations. In the long evenings after her teaching day, Elsa wrote. She wrote down every story her mother had ever told her about Norway, and about Minnesota, and about the night her father died, and about the day Bjorn had refused to let her mother walk into the snow. She wrote down the design of the cabin in detail with measurements and drawings. She wrote down what every family in the valley had said about it in the spring of 1883, and what they had said in the spring of 1884. She wrote down the names of the 7 people who had died in the storm. She wrote them down so they would not be forgotten. When she retired from teaching in 1948, she was 72 years old. She spent the next 8 years organizing her papers. In 1956, she donated the entire collection to the Montana Historical Society in Helena. The collection contained 470 pages of handwritten notes, 63 drawings, and a small wooden box containing one item. The item was a hammer, a claw hammer with a hickory handle, the head dark with use. The Solberg structure stood for 60 years. It survived 60 Montana winters. It housed 3 generations. Olaf Bergman died in it in 1903. Astrid died in it in 1911 at the age of 59 after a brief illness in the same bed she had built with her husband 24 years earlier. Elsa kept the structure as a summer place after her marriage, and her children and her grandchildren came out every summer to swim in the creek and to ride the descendants of the Bay Gelding. In 1943, the structure was dismantled to salvage lumber for the war effort. The heavy ridge beam, the 32-foot lodgepole pine that Astrid and Olaf had raised on a tripod and a block and tackle in the summer of 1883, was donated to a shipyard in Portland, Oregon, where it became briefly part of the keel of a Liberty ship that carried supplies across the Atlantic in the last years of the war. The stone foundation remained visible until the late 1970s, when modern development finally erased it. But photographs exist, drawings exist, the collection in Helena exists, and contemporary architects who designed for extreme climates in Alaska, in northern Canada, and Scandinavia still use, sometimes without knowing the source, the principles that an old man named Olav had told a 6-year-old girl in a fjord in northern Norway, and that the girl had remembered 24 years later on a cold January night in a Montana dugout, while an old gray shepherd refused to let her walk out into the snow. In April of 1884, 4 men walked out across a stretch of melting snow east of Bozeman to find a body. They found Hollis Calloway with his arm raised. He was 17 feet from his own door. In April of 1884, in a strange long structure 3 miles south, a woman and her daughter and a black yearling steer named Magnus and a small new puppy named Bjorn II sat on the front porch in the spring sun and watched the snow retreat from the fence posts. The distance between those two scenes was the distance Astrid Solberg had been right about all along. The distance was measured in feet and in degrees Fahrenheit and in cords of dry firewood and in the thickness of a wall and in the patience of an old gray dog from Norway who had lived long enough to teach a frightened young woman that she did not have to walk alone into the snow. The distance was also measured in something else. It was measured in the moment when a proud woman had finally opened her door and let a valley walk through it. In the moment when Mirabelle Calloway, on the worst day of her life, had ridden with her son across 3 miles of snow to stand at the foot of a porch and speak. In the moment when Cormac Sullivan had pulled down his bandages to show his scars to a sheriff. In the moment when Hester Ainsworth, who had buried 2 husbands and asked no man for anything in 12 years, had asked. A storm came. 7 people died. 1 woman lived because she had built for the country she stood in instead of the country other people came from. And then she lived a second time on a porch in November because she finally learned what her old dog had been trying to teach her since the dugout. That standing alone in a wind is not the same as standing strong. That a structure, no matter how clever, does not warm a child without a community around it. That sometimes the bravest thing a hard person ever does is open a door and let other people come in. Build for your country. Solve the problem you actually have. Keep your firewood dry. And when the storm comes, and it always comes, know who will stand on your porch with you when the law arrives with paper. Astrid Solberg knew in the end. It took her 2,000 miles and 2 winters and 1 blizzard and 1 old dog to learn it. But she knew. That is why her daughter lived. That is why her structure stood. That is why 140 years later, in the long, quiet evenings of a different century, an old man somewhere in America can sit by his own fire and hear this story and feel in the slow turning of his chest that he has known women like Astrid Solberg in his own life, his mother perhaps, his grandmother, the wife of a friend, a neighbor long ago on a road he has not driven down in many years. They are the ones who build. They are the ones who keep the fire. They are the ones who, when the storm comes down out of the high country, stand at the door and refuse to let anyone freeze. Hold them in your memory tonight. The ones who built for you, the ones who opened the door when the law came, the ones who kept your firewood dry. That is the whole story. And it is, in the end, the only story worth telling.